The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy farmers' market in downtown Boston. Dr. Marcus Chen, a 45-year-old professor at Harvard University, walked between the colorful stalls with his usual calm and friendly manner. Every Saturday for the past 10 years, he came to this market to buy fresh ingredients for his famous West African jollof rice, a recipe passed down through generations. Marcus wore his favorite blue sweater and comfortable walking shoes, pushing his shopping cart past displays of fresh fruits and vegetables. His wire-rimmed glasses sat perfectly on his nose, and his kind eyes showed the wisdom of someone who had spent their life learning and teaching. As a professor of African history, he loved sharing knowledge with his students and anyone else who wanted to learn. The market was especially crowded today. People from all walks of life filled the narrow paths between stalls, carrying bags full of fresh produce and chatting with the local farmers. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakery stand and sweet strawberries from the fruit vendors. Children ran around with free samples of local honey, while their parents compared prices on organic vegetables. At the Thompson family's vegetable stand, Marcus carefully picked through the tomatoes. He needed the perfect ones for his rice dish. Mrs. Thompson, who had known him for years, smiled and asked about his latest research project. As they talked, more people gathered around, interested in their conversation about ancient African trading routes and how they shaped today's world. Marcus enjoyed these quiet Saturday mornings. They reminded him of shopping with his grandmother in their old neighborhood when he was young. She had taught him how to pick the freshest ingredients and how to cook with love and patience. Now, as a successful professor, he carried those memories with him everywhere he went. While examining a particularly ripe tomato, Marcus overheard conversations around him. People discussed their weekend plans, shared recipes, and talked about local news. The farmers' market had always been more than just a place to buy food. It was where the community came together. Marcus knew most of the regular vendors by name, and they knew him as the friendly professor who always had an interesting story to share. Near the spice stand, Marcus stopped to buy some fresh thyme and bay leaves. The owner, Mr. Patel, had specially ordered some African spices for him last week. As they discussed the different ways to use the spices, a small crowd gathered to listen. Marcus always found ways to connect food with history, explaining how ancient trade routes brought these spices from one continent to another. The morning grew warmer as Marcus finished selecting his ingredients. His cart now held perfectly ripe tomatoes, fresh herbs, onions, and the special spices he needed. He planned to host a dinner party that evening for some of his fellow professors, where he would show them how traditional African cuisine had influenced modern cooking. As he walked toward the final stall to buy some garlic, Marcus noticed an elderly white woman watching him. She seemed upset about something, though he couldn't imagine what. In all his years coming to this market, he had always felt welcome and appreciated. The woman's intense stare made him slightly uncomfortable, but he continued with his shopping, maintaining his usual friendly demeanor. The sounds of the market filled the air, vendors calling out their specials, children laughing, and the general buzz of conversation. Marcus checked his watch, noting he had about 20 more minutes before he needed to head home to start cooking. He didn't know it yet, but this ordinary Saturday morning was about to become very different from his usual market visits. Looking back at his shopping list one last time, Marcus smiled, thinking about how his grandmother would be proud to see him keeping their family traditions alive in a new place. The morning had been peaceful and productive so far, just the way he liked it. But as he turned toward the checkout area, he had no idea that in just a few moments, an unexpected confrontation would test his patience, wisdom, and ability to turn an ugly situation into a powerful teaching moment. Patricia Walsh had been shopping at the farmers' market for over 30 years, and she didn't like how things were changing. At 72 years old, with her gray hair perfectly styled and her expensive beige coat buttoned up despite the warm weather, she believed she knew what was best for her market. Today, something about Dr. Marcus Chen bothered her more than usual. She had watched him for the past 20 minutes, the way people gathered around him at every stall, how vendors smiled at him, and how children waved as he passed by. In her mind, he was getting too comfortable, too familiar with everyone. When he stopped at the garlic stand, the last stop on his shopping route, Patricia decided it was time to act. The metal shopping cart made a harsh sound as she deliberately pushed it into Marcus's cart. The impact wasn't hard enough to damage anything, but it was clearly intentional. Several nearby shoppers turned to look at the source of the noise. Marcus, who had been carefully selecting garlic bulbs, looked up with mild surprise on his face. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely, even though he wasn't the one who had caused the collision. He started to move his cart aside to give her more space. Patricia's face twisted into an unpleasant expression. "You people are always in the way," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the market aisle. More heads turned toward them. "Taking up space that doesn't belong to you." The friendly chatter around them began to die down. A young mother pulled her children closer. Mr. Pethel, the spice vendor, stopped arranging his display and watched with concern. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus maintained his calm expression, though his hands tightened slightly on his cart handle. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he began, but Patricia wasn't finished. "I've been shopping here since before you were born," she continued, her voice getting louder with each word. "This used to be a nice market, a proper market. Now look at it." She gestured wildly around her, nearly knocking over a display of fresh garlic. People had stopped pretending not to notice. A circle formed around them, with some market-goers pulling out their phones. The weekend security guard, Tom, started moving in their direction, but he was still several stalls away. Marcus opened his mouth to speak again, but Patricia cut him off with the words that would change everything. "Why don't you just go back to Africa where you came from?" The market fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Someone gasped. A teenager's phone clattered to the ground. The only sound was the distant traffic from the street beyond the market. Marcus stood there, perfectly still, as all eyes turned to him. A Harvard professor had faced discrimination before, but never so publicly, never so blatantly. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. Some looked away in embarrassment, others in anger, but most watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Mrs. Thompson, the vegetable vendor who had known Marcus for years, started to come out from behind her stall. Mr. Paddle took a step forward. Even Tom, the security guard, quickened his pace. But before anyone could intervene, something unexpected happened. Marcus Chen smiled. It wasn't a forced smile, or an angry one, or even a sad one. It was the same warm, genuine smile he gave his students when they asked an interesting question. The same smile he shared with vendors when discussing their produce. The kind of smile that could only come from someone who knew exactly who they were and what they had to offer the world. Patricia Walsh, who had expected anger, arguments, or even tears, found herself taking a small step backward. The crowd held its breath. Nobody knew what was coming next, but they could sense that this moment would be different from the usual angry confrontations they had seen or heard about. As Marcus adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, still smiling, he prepared to give the response that would soon be shared thousands of times across social media. A response that would turn this ugly moment into something entirely unexpected. The professor's eyes sparkled with the light of someone who saw this not as an insult, but as a teaching opportunity. Marcus Chen's smile remained steady as he reached into his jacket pocket. The crowd watched nervously, and what he pulled out was simply his smartphone. Patricia Walsh took another small step backward, confusion replacing the anger on her face. This wasn't following the script she had expected. "Actually," Marcus said in his warm teaching voice, the same one that had made him a favorite professor at Harvard, "I have been to Africa many times. Would you like to see something amazing?" He didn't wait for her response, but instead pulled up a photo gallery on his phone. The first image showed Marcus standing next to an ancient building made of golden brown stone. The structure seemed to glow in the desert sunlight. "This is the University of Timbuktu," he explained, his voice carrying clearly in the silent market. It was one of the world's first universities, built in the 12th century. People traveled from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East to study there. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, pushed through the crowd to get a better look at the phone. "That's older than Harvard," he exclaimed. Several people chuckled, breaking some of the tension in the air. "Much older," Marcus agreed, swiping to the next photo. This one showed ancient manuscripts, their pages covered in beautiful writing. These are some of the oldest books about astronomy in the world. The scholars at Timbuktu were studying the stars and planets hundreds of years before telescopes were invented. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had expected shouting, anger, or maybe tears. Instead, she was getting a history lesson, and despite herself, she found it interesting. Other shoppers began moving closer, drawn in by Marcus's gentle voice and fascinating photos. Here's something really special, Marcus continued, showing another picture. This one featured a series of complex mathematical equations written in an ancient script. These calculations were used to predict solar eclipses. Some of them are so accurate that modern scientists still use similar methods today. Mr. Patel, the spice vendor, spoke up from the edge of the growing crowd. Dr. Chen, isn't it true that many of our modern words for numbers came from Africa? His question was genuine, and Marcus's face lit up at the opportunity to share more knowledge. Exactly right. Marcus turned slightly so more people could see his phone as he pulled up a new image. The word algebra itself comes from North Africa. Many of the mathematical concepts we use today were first developed by African scholars. The crowd had grown larger now. Someone had brought over a folding chair for Patricia, who sat down heavily, her shopping basket forgotten at her feet. The anger had completely left her face, replaced by a look of bewilderment and growing interest. Marcus swiped to another photo, this one showing him working with a team of archaeologists at a dig site. Last summer, I helped uncover a library that had been buried in the sand for centuries. We found books about medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics. These African scholars were making breakthrough discoveries while much of Europe was still in the Dark Ages. A teenager in the crowd raised her hand, just as if she were in one of Marcus's lectures. But why didn't we learn about any of this in school? She asked. Marcus's smile turned slightly sad, but his voice remained kind. That's a very good question. Sometimes, history gets written by people who want to tell only one side of the story. That's why it's so important to learn about all parts of our shared human history. He turned back to Patricia, who was now leaning forward in her chair, her earlier hostility forgotten in the face of this unexpected education. You told me to go back to Africa, Marcus said gently. I do go back, several times a year. I go to learn, to teach, and to remind everyone that human knowledge and achievement belong to all of us, regardless of where we come from. The morning sun had risen higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the market. The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word. What had started as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something entirely different. A moment of shared learning and growing understanding. And Marcus Chen wasn't finished yet. He had more to share, more bridges to build, more minds to open. The farmers' market had transformed into an impromptu classroom. More chairs appeared from nearby stalls, and people sat in a semicircle around Marcus Chen. Even the vendors left their stations to join the growing audience. Patricia Walsh remained in her front row seat, her shopping forgotten beside her, as Marcus continued sharing his knowledge. Let me show you something truly special, Marcus said, pulling up a new set of photos on his phone. He connected it to Mr. Rodriguez's iPad from the coffee stand, and the vendor quickly set up his portable projector screen used for weekend movie nights. Now everyone could see the images clearly. The first new photo showed a complex surgical tool. This was found in ancient Egypt, Marcus explained, his voice carrying easily through the crowd. It's over 3,000 years old and was used for eye surgery. The technique they developed was so advanced that it's similar to what doctors use today. A nurse in the crowd raised her hand. I work at Boston General, and you're right. Our modern tools look almost exactly like that. Her comment caused excited whispers among the audience. Patricia leaned forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on the screen. Marcus swiped to the next image, showing an ancient calendar carved in stone. This was used to track seasons for farming. African astronomers could predict weather patterns by studying the stars. They knew exactly when to plant crops and when to harvest them. He glanced at Patricia. Much like how you probably know the best seasons to buy different vegetables here at the market. Patricia nodded slowly, making the connection. For the first time, a small smile appeared on her face. The next photo showed beautiful geometric patterns on cloth. These designs aren't just decorative, Marcus continued. They're actually complex mathematical formulas woven into fabric. Each pattern tells a story and teaches a lesson. Some contain mathematical principles that weren't discovered in Europe until centuries later. A math teacher from the local high school stood up excitedly. Those look like fractals. We teach those in advanced geometry, she exclaimed. Marcus beamed at her observation. Exactly. These African textile makers understood fractal geometry long before it had a formal name in mathematics. They passed this knowledge down through generations through their art. The crowd was completely engrossed. Someone had started a live stream on their phone, sharing this unexpected morning lesson with viewers online. Comments began pouring in from around the world. Marcus showed another image, this one of himself with a group of children in a modern African classroom. This was taken last month at a school in Mali. These students are learning to code using traditional African mathematical principles. They're creating apps that help farmers predict weather patterns using both ancient wisdom and modern technology. Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she raised it. The crowd held its breath. Marcus nodded encouragingly at her. I had no idea, she said quietly. We never learned any of this in school. Why didn't we learn this? Marcus's response was gentle but firm. Often, history is written by those who want to maintain their own power. But the truth is, human knowledge belongs to everyone. Every civilization has contributed to making our world what it is today. He showed one final photo, a satellite image of Africa at night. Look at these lights. Each one represents a center of learning, innovation, and progress. Africa isn't just our past, it's very much our present and future. The morning had grown warm, but nobody moved to leave. Market vendors started passing out free samples of their products, fresh fruit, bread, and coffee, as the impromptu history lesson continued. The atmosphere had completely changed from tension to genuine curiosity and learning. Tom, the security guard who had initially rushed over to prevent a conflict, was now helping organize the crowd as more people arrived, drawn by the live stream. What had started as a moment of prejudice was transforming into something extraordinary, a bridge of understanding built with knowledge and patience. Patricia sat quietly, her earlier anger replaced by something new, curiosity. As Marcus prepared to share more photos and stories, it was clear that this Saturday morning at the farmers' market would be remembered not for how it started, but for what it was becoming. A powerful lesson in how knowledge could transform hearts and minds. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the farmers' market had become something magical. The usual Saturday shopping rush had paused, replaced by an atmosphere of shared discovery. Patricia Walsh, who had started the day with anger in her heart, now sat with tears forming in her eyes as Dr. Marcus Chen shared more stories of African innovation. In West Africa, Marcus explained, showing a new image on the projector screen, there was a system of writing that existed hundreds of years before European contact. Look at these symbols. The screen displayed intricate characters carved into ancient wood. Each symbol represents not just a word, but an entire concept or story. A local English teacher in the crowd nodded enthusiastically. Like Egyptian hieroglyphs, she asked. Similar, yes, Marcus replied with a warm smile. But this system was so complex that it could convey entire philosophical debates in just a few characters. Some modern computers use similar principles for data compression. Patricia's hand shook slightly as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. She began taking notes, something she hadn't done since her school days 50 years ago. Her handwriting was wobbly but determined. The crowd had grown even larger. Someone had set up a coffee station, and the smell of fresh brew mixed with the market's usual morning scents. Children sat cross-legged on blankets spread over the ground, their eyes wide with wonder as Marcus showed pictures of ancient African cities with buildings that seemed to touch the sky. These structures, Marcus said, pointing to a magnificent building in Mali, were built with natural air conditioning systems. The architects understood how to use wind patterns and temperature differences to keep buildings cool in the desert heat. Modern architects are studying these designs to create energy-efficient buildings today. A local contractor raised his hand. You mean they had climate control without electricity? That's incredible. Exactly. Marcus beamed. They understood their environment so well that they could work with nature instead of against it. Patricia's notebook pages were filling up quickly. Her earlier frown had been replaced by a look of intense concentration. When she looked up at Marcus now, there was no trace of her previous hostility, only a growing hunger for knowledge. The live-stream comments section was exploding with viewers from around the world. People were sharing their own stories, asking questions, and expressing amazement at what they were learning. The local news had picked up the story, and a reporter stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, capturing this unexpected moment of community transformation. Marcus moved on to show images of ancient African musical instruments. These drums weren't just for music, he explained. They were a sophisticated communication system that could send messages across vast distances, like an early version of Morse code. The drummers could transmit complex messages that everyone in neighboring villages could understand. A music teacher from the local high school shook her head in amazement. "We need to update our music history curriculum," she said firmly. Patricia suddenly spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. I've lived here all my life," she said, drawing everyone's attention. "I thought I knew everything I needed to know, but I've learned more in the past hour than I learned in all my years of school." Her voice cracked slightly with emotion. Marcus walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Learning is a lifelong journey," he said kindly. "Every day is a chance to discover something new, to see the world differently." The market vendors, who had been listening intently, began sharing their own connections to the story. Mr. Paddle talked about ancient trade routes between Africa and India. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about similar architectural techniques found in ancient South American cities. The farmers' market had become a place where barriers between cultures were falling away, replaced by bridges of understanding. Patricia looked around at the diverse crowd, seeing them with new eyes. The same people she had viewed with suspicion earlier now felt like fellow students in life's great classroom. Her transformation wasn't complete. Such changes don't happen in an instant. But a door had opened in her mind, and through it, light was beginning to shine. The farmers' market had never stayed open this late into the morning before, but today was different. No one wanted to leave as Dr. Marcus Chen continued sharing knowledge that was changing how everyone saw the world. Even those who had come just to buy groceries found themselves drawn into this extraordinary moment of learning. "Let me tell you about something that changed medicine forever," Marcus said, pulling up a new image on the screen. It showed an ancient painting of a medical procedure. In ancient Egypt, doctors performed brain surgery with a success rate that wasn't matched until the 1900s. The tools and techniques they developed are still studied in medical schools today. A medical student from Boston University stood up excitedly. "We just learned about this in our history of medicine class. They had special tools to protect the brain during surgery, right?" "Exactly." Marcus smiled warmly. They understood human anatomy so well that they could perform complex surgeries safely. They even had painkillers made from natural plants that worked as effectively as some modern medicines. Patricia Walsh, still taking notes in her small notebook, looked up with surprise. "But I thought modern medicine started in Europe," she said, her voice now curious rather than confrontational. "That's what many people think," Marcus replied gently. "But healing knowledge has come from all parts of the world. For example, in what is now Mali, doctors performed successful cataract surgeries hundreds of years ago. They understood how to remove cataracts and restore sight." The local pharmacist, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Many of our modern drugs come from African plants, don't they, like aspirin?" "Yes." Marcus showed a picture of a willow tree. The bark of this tree was used in many parts of Africa for pain relief. European scientists later studied it and created what we now call aspirin. This knowledge came from African healers who had used it for generations. A young girl raised her hand. "My grandma is from Nigeria, and she always gives us special tea when we're sick. She says it's an old family recipe." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Traditional medicine often contains wisdom passed down through generations. Scientists to date are studying many of these ancient remedies and finding that they have real medical benefits. He moved on to show images of ancient African cities. These cities had public health systems that were far ahead of their time. They built special drainage systems to prevent disease, public baths for cleanliness, and even quarantine areas to stop the spread of illness. A city planner in the crowd whistled in appreciation. "Some modern cities could learn from that kind of planning," she said. Patricia had filled several pages of her notebook by now. Her hand was tired, but she kept writing. Each new piece of information seemed to wash away a little more of her old prejudices, replacing them with wonder and understanding. Marcus continued, showing pictures of ancient African hospitals. These weren't just places for treating illness. They were centers of learning where doctors shared knowledge and trained new healers. They understood that medical knowledge belongs to everyone and should be shared for the benefit of all people. The live stream comments were full of medical professionals from around the world, sharing their own knowledge of how African medicine had influenced modern healthcare. A doctor from Egypt talked about ancient surgical techniques still used today. A nurse from Ethiopia shared stories of traditional healing practices that modern science was just beginning to understand. But perhaps the most important medical lesson from ancient Africa, Marcus said, his voice growing softer, making everyone lean in to listen, was that healing isn't just about treating the body. These doctors understood that we must also heal the mind and spirit. They knew that hatred and fear can make us sick, but knowledge and understanding can make us whole. Patricia looked down at her notes, then back up at Marcus. Her eyes were wet with tears, but these were different from the angry tears of the morning. These were tears of understanding, of seeing the world in a new way. The market had become completely still. Even the birds seemed to be listening. The morning's ugly confrontation had transformed into something beautiful, a moment of shared learning that was healing wounds much older and deeper than anyone had expected. The afternoon sun now hung high above the farmer's market, casting shorter shadows across the transformed space. What had begun as a typical Saturday morning had become a moment that would be remembered by everyone present. Patricia Walsh sat in her chair, her notebook full of hastily written notes, as the full weight of her morning's journey began to sink in. Dr. Marcus Chen was showing his final set of photographs, these focusing on modern Africa. "This is the Square Kilometre Array Telescope in South Africa," he explained, pointing to an image of massive satellite dishes pointing toward the sky. "It's the largest telescope in the world, helping us understand the universe in ways we never could before." The crowd, which had been growing steadily all morning, now numbered over 200 people. Local news crews had arrived, setting up cameras at the edges of the gathering. The live stream had gone viral, with viewers tuning in from every continent. And here, Marcus continued, showing a picture of young students in a high-tech classroom, is the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences. Students from all over the world come here to study advanced mathematics and artificial intelligence. Many of them are using ancient African mathematical principles to develop new computer algorithms. Patricia's hands trembled as she looked at her watch. She had been sitting here for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours that had completely changed how she saw the world. Her face flushed red with embarrassment as she remembered her earlier words, but that shame was being replaced by something else, a desperate hunger to learn more. A young tech worker from a local startup raised his hand. "So you're saying that some of our modern computer systems are based on African mathematical principles?" "Exactly," Marcus smiled. "The binary system we use in computers today, the ones and zeros, has roots in ancient African divination systems that use binary patterns to solve complex problems. The past and present are always connected." The market vendors had adapted to this unusual day. They moved among the crowd selling water, snacks, and fresh fruit. Mrs. Thompson had even set up a small table with free samples of African-inspired dishes she had prepared. The atmosphere was no longer that of a simple market, it had become a celebration of learning and understanding. Patricia slowly stood up from her chair. The crowd grew quiet, remembering how this all began. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "Dr. Chen, I've lived in this neighborhood for 72 years. I thought I knew everything I needed to know." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. "But I've been living in ignorance. Real ignorance, not the kind I accused you of." Marcus walked over to her, his face showing no anger or resentment, only kindness. The crowd watched in respectful silence. "I was so proud of my education," Patricia continued, her voice growing stronger. "I graduated from high school in 1971, but in 3 hours, you've taught me more than I learned in all my years of school. You've shown me that I was the one who needed to learn, to grow, to understand." Someone in the crowd started to clap, but Patricia held up her hand. "No, please, I don't deserve applause. What I deserve is to keep learning." She turned to face Marcus directly. Would you be willing to teach me more?" The market fell completely silent. Even the news crews leaned in closer. Marcus's warm smile grew wider as he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a book. "This is the textbook I use in my introductory course at Harvard," he said, holding it out to her. "But I think you've already started the most important lesson." "What's that?" Patricia asked, accepting the book with trembling hands. "That knowledge isn't just about facts and figures, Marcus replied, "It's about opening our hearts to new understandings, about seeing the connections that bind all people together through time and space." The crowd burst into spontaneous applause. Phones captured the moment from every angle. The live stream comments exploded with messages of hope and support. But Patricia barely noticed any of it. She was already opening the book, eager to continue her journey of transformation. 1 month had passed since that transformative Saturday at the farmer's market. The video of Dr. Marcus Chen's impromptu history lesson had been viewed millions of times across the world. But the real story of change was happening in a small classroom at Harvard University every Tuesday evening. Patricia Walsh sat in the front row of Marcus's African History Night class, her new notebook open and ready. She had enrolled as an audit student, attending classes alongside regular college students. Her white hair and kind smile had become a familiar sight in the classroom, where she'd often shared her own journey of transformation with younger students. Today, Marcus announced to his class, "We have something special planned." He gestured to Patricia, who slowly stood up from her seat. The other students, many of whom had watched the viral video, paid close attention. "When Dr. Chen first offered me this book," Patricia held up her now well-worn textbook, covered in sticky notes and highlights, "I didn't know it would change my entire life. But here I am, 1 month later, and I want to share what I've learned." She walked to the front of the classroom, her steps steady and confident. The fear and anger that had filled her that market morning were long gone, replaced by a peaceful wisdom that comes from truly opening one's mind and heart. "Last week, I visited my old high school," Patricia continued. "I spoke to the principal about updating their history curriculum. They've agreed to start a pilot program teaching the true history of African contributions to world civilization. Dr. Chen has offered to help design the course." The classroom erupted in applause. Marcus beamed with pride at his oldest student, who had become one of his most passionate advocates for educational change. "But that's not all," Patricia smiled, pulling out a folder. "Remember the farmer's market where this all started? Well, we're starting a new program there too. Every Saturday morning, different professors from local universities will give free public lectures about world history, science, and culture. Dr. Chen will give the first lecture next week." The market had indeed transformed. The spot where Patricia had once confronted Marcus was now marked with a small plaque that read, "Knowledge transforms. Understanding heals." Weekly educational programs had turned the market into a place of learning as well as shopping. "The most amazing thing," Patricia said, her voice growing soft with emotion, "is how many people have reached out to share similar stories. People who held on to old prejudices because they never learned the truth. People who changed their minds when they learned about the real history of human achievement." Marcus stepped forward to stand beside her. "Patricia has taught us all something valuable," he said to the class. "It's never too late to learn, never too late to change, never too late to open your heart to new understanding." The classroom door opened, and several familiar faces entered. Mr. Patel from the spice stand, Mrs. Thompson from the vegetable stall, and other market vendors. They had all enrolled in the next semester's night class, inspired by Patricia's example. "We're starting a scholarship too," Patricia announced, her eyes bright with purpose. "The Market Square Education Fund will help send students to Africa to study at the universities Dr. Chen showed us in his pictures. We'd already raised enough money to send 2 students next year." The video of that market morning had sparked similar programs across the country. Other communities were organizing their own public education initiatives, breaking down barriers of prejudice through knowledge and understanding. As the class ended that evening, Patricia walked with Marcus through the Harvard campus. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn golden, much like the pages of her beloved textbook. Students greeted them as they passed, many stopping to chat about the upcoming market lecture series. "You know," Patricia said, looking up at the historic university buildings, "when you told me to keep learning, I thought it was just about facts and history. But it's really about learning to see the world, and yourself, differently." Marcus nodded, understanding perfectly. Every day is a chance to learn something new, to grow, to change. "And to heal," Patricia added, clutching her books close to her heart. "Knowledge doesn't just fill our minds, it heals our hearts." They reached the campus gate, where their paths would separate until the next class. But the journey they had started that market morning would continue, touching more lives and opening more hearts, one lesson at a time.